So when I got into gardening, I'm in San Diego. Everybody has what I call crappy soil in San Diego. Not everybody, not me. A few other people can raise their hands and say that their soil is pretty good. But when you start off, you're either dealing with clay, granite, decomposed granite, or sandy soil. And it's just not a lot of areas with a lot of organic matter in your soil. And that's a really hard thing to do because organic matter, it weighs a lot, and in the form of organic waste, most people don't want to deal with it. And so when I started gardening, to fix heavy clay soil, which I had, the answer was add organic matter, add compost. So I was bringing in compost in my little Hyundai Tiburon, and it was not a very easy thing to do. Once I moved a yard of material in this little car, and it just didn't make sense. So I started looking into things that did make sense, and having a worm bin and having a compost bin are the beginnings of putting organic matter back into your soil. The hard thing about having a compost bin, if anybody who's listening has started one, is having enough either green waste that's going to provide nitrogen, or brown waste, which is going to provide carbon to your compost. And one of the easiest answers to that is Bocashi, because it doesn't really need carbon to nitrogen ratios and other weird things you get into when you start trying to do regular composting. Bokashi is a process of fermenting food waste before it rots. So if you have an airtight container, you can take this food waste, inoculate it, and store it until you're ready to compost it. And when you're composting it, you don't have to deal with the traditional issues that compost has. I can compost anything. I can compost bones, fat, dairy, meats, and of course all the fruits and vegetables as well. And I don't have to figure out how to get the compost in the right carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's just automatic. It pre-ferments. I put it in the regular compost pile or my soil, and it breaks down. So Ed will let you get into the basics of how a home system uses Bokashi.
Oop, let me get some slides over for you. So yeah, so this is our home system. Really simple. Really, we have a two-sided sink. You can change this up, but this is how we do it. We have a simple gray water bowl that we can capture gray water. I go and use this to go put it into my trees. And then we have a bowl that with a lid that we just, our family, just whatever food waste we have, we throw into this bowl while we're cooking. And I'm sort of, the designated Bokashi guy. I'm the one that deals with it. But everybody will just put it in. And once that is full, we have a little station in our kitchen that we have set up, and we have a 5-gallon bucket with a gamma lid, which is a easily spinnable, removable lid that's airtight. And then we have a little open bucket that has Bokashi inoculate. Now, Bokashi inoculate is basically any carbon source. This just happens to be rice husk, but Ron, what he does is he makes this, and he will wet this out with the beneficial microbial and then dry it. And what that does is it essentially makes the microbial hibernate and stable. And so you can just keep this without a smell. There's no smell. It's just rice husk, in a bucket. And then we take that, and I open the lid, and I pour my food waste into that. And then I just take a little bit of this Bokashi inoculate, and I sprinkle it into this, and I walk away. I cap it and walk away. Now, when this is full, we're vegetarians, so we don't have meat, so we leave this in here full for a week, and that's plenty time, at least a week, and that's plenty time for the Bokashi to do its thing. And essentially, what it's like is this is a stomach, and it's pre-digesting my food waste. And if you look in here, I've actually got some like bread bags and some other like paper products I've been experimenting with, just throwing it in because I want all that in my soil anyway. So I put it in there and I set it aside and I start a new bucket. And once this is done, what I do is the system I use is I put the Bocashi inside a bucket. So I have a tree. Ron builds boxes around his trees, but I do this with, I take the bucket that was existing that I bought my tree in, I put it in the ground. This just happens to be another bucket I put on top to make sure critters didn't get in there, but it could be a plate, it could be a piece of wood, just something to cap it. And so if I take this bucket off, I pour it in there, and what happens is that in a couple weeks, suddenly I've got a worm party, and I'm not exactly sure where they show up, but they're there. They suddenly come out of nowhere and they come into these buckets. Now the bottom of the bucket is either cut open on the bottom, which I've tested out, or I just leave it with the natural holes from the bucket, and they show up either way. And so
can you talk about the importance of worms? That was one of the questions from one of our viewers, so I thought I'd throw that in there.
Oh yeah. Okay, so worms in general, when we're starting to talk about soil health, if you're into gardening, you'll hear, oh, worm castings, they're the most amazing thing for your garden. And you can go and buy bags of worm castings. Essentially, people are doing this for you. They're feeding worms food waste, and then they're harvesting those castings and then selling to you for a good amount of money. And what the Bocashi system does is it's just super simple. You are taking your food waste, you're now just putting it in somewhere. You can dig a hole and bury it if you wanted to and cover it with some dirt and walk away from it. I put them in these buckets on the drip lines. They now create all of this worm casting directly in this bucket. And then when I want to feed my tree, I'll just water inside this bucket, and it pushes all the worm casting tea down through this bucket into the drip line of my trees, and my trees are thriving. And so the worms are there in your soil because their natural cycle of pooping and peeing is fertility, is candy to plants, basically. And that's what you want. You want to have soil that's living like this, and having all these worms are really beneficial. They open up aeration in your soil. They do all kinds of things. In fact, I've heard that way back in the day, a piece of property, say a farm, was actually, the value of that land was decided based on if you put a shovel in the ground, how many worms you found. So, this system creates this. And if we were to go buy worms, they're about $30 a pound to buy worms. So we're essentially just kind of cutting to the chase. We're taking any food product, meat, dairy, veggies, whatever. We're throwing it in a bucket, which we're going to have to throw it in some sort of trash receptacle anyway. We then let it go through its process. We put it in the ground. It turns into all the things our garden loves, and then everything just takes off and thrives.
So I got a few questions from our viewers about the Bocashi, and Ed, why don't you stay up there, because I'm sure you got a picture for this too.
Okay.
So they're asking, so with Bocashi, is there no big compost bin? ? So
yeah, we're going to give you the amazing answer of it depends.
Yeah.
If you want to, yes. If you love composting and you have a massive compost pile or a small one, and you just absolutely love turning that pile, and you love compost, you're going to love this, because when you put it into your compost pile, that thing will kick off to what, Ron, 140 degrees or something?
120 to 160. My piles get up to about 160 after I integrate food waste into them.
Yeah. So it's like a composting Kickstarter. And so you can do that, or you can be super lazy like me and not do that at all, and just go basically right to my tree, pour it in, walk away, and then it's getting the benefits of it. I personally am trying to streamline my stuff, so I'm really into cutting out as many steps as possible, and that's what Bocashi's been doing for me.
And then where are you guys sourcing the Bocashi?
So I produce Bocashi here in San Diego. My first batch I bought on Amazon, like many people. I bought a Bocashi kit that had a bucket with a spigot and some other things. And being the DIYer that I am, I produced this whole little contraption where I had 4 buckets that drained all the liquid into a common receptacle. And then I started looking at it and seeing how inefficient the process was. And so I wanted to test it and put it to the test. And so I made a bucket and I didn't put a drain in it. And here in San Diego or in Southern California, it's hot most of the year. Even in the winter, we have days when it's in the 60s, 70s, 80 degrees. So I want my compost to be moist all year round without having to add water to it. So I stopped using buckets that had a spigot and just throwing all my food waste in there. And that's really what started my company, Feed the Soil, producing Bocashi inoculant and Bocashi kits and providing education on how efficient the process is.
I got another question for you guys from Robert. He's asking, how much emphasis do you put into filtered water versus tap water?
Ed, you can start with that.
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of filtered water myself. You know, there's something I got turned on to maybe a couple years ago was the fact that, you know, once I started looking into my soil as being a living thing, and I was spending all this effort, you know, building my soil and building the microbial and the mycelium and all the little buggies that go in there, I realized that my tap water from my hose had tons of chlorine, and chlorine's killing off. It's killing off all the work that I was doing. So at the time, I had a workshop, and it was next to a company called, I think they're called Dime Water, and they actually started producing a filter of for garden hoses, and it's just a chlorine filter. And so what I noticed is that was really good. When I started to, you know, if I was going to water something with my hose, I started, you know, using the water from that filter, and I've noticed a difference from it. But the other thing that we try to do is, you know, we look at rainwater as a fertilizer and as a premium. So we started putting, you know, buckets and, you know, more barrels, like trash cans and things like that, just to kind of make a simple catchment system. And we have a really weird house. It has a lot of different roof lines, and so it's really tough to consolidate it. But we started just capturing it, and we would use that in our garden. And when it overflowed, I drilled a hole into the top of the bucket, attached a garden hose to it, and would run it over to my fruit trees. And so every rain event, I just kind of moved those around and soak as much water as I could into the soil for those trees. And I just started getting really good results from that. The cleaner the water that went into my garden, the better it was doing. And again, this is just all observation. Mm-hmm. You know, Ron and I both are just, you know, we learn from observation. So we're really, you know, just paying attention, trying things. We experiment a ton and then see what works, what doesn't. And believe me, I've killed a lot of things and things haven't worked out. But then other things, you know, have been great, and I log those in my brain. And water is definitely, you know, sands, chlorine definitely makes a difference.
One of the other things about having a regenerative landscape and having mulch and coverage of your soil is you're getting a lot less evaporation. So for my yard, I usually don't even start watering most of my annual plants until late summer. So like my peaches and stuff like that, where there are these guilds of collard greens and pumpkin and stuff that shade out the soil around the drip line of the tree, they hold a lot more water from, even if it's just a little bit of water over the winter, but it's been more over these past few winters. But I don't have to water as much. So my fruits are sweeter because they don't have as much water in them. And what I like to do, I like to build, if I am going to build a planter box, I'll build what's called a sub-irrigated bed, where most of the year, the rainwater is filling up those sub-irrigated beds, and they are wicking water back up, just like my landscape, but I'm producing it on a smaller scale. And these things hold anywhere from 50 to or 25 to 150 gallons of water, and that water wicks back up, and then I don't have to use chlorinated city water, which one costs a whole lot more than my free water that's coming out of the sky.
Which I have one of those beds that you build at the farm, and they are incredible. They, you know, during 100 to 110 degree heat over the summer, I think it has 60 gallons in the aquifer of it, and I didn't have to water it for 3 weeks, and then over winter it filled up as it rained. So yeah, I'm a fan of those. I'm a fan of those as well.
Now, Ed, I got another question for you. From one of our viewers is asking, I have a community garden plot. All the plots get tilled together each year. What's the best way to quickly help that soil? Would it be helpful to dig bags of lawn clippings into the soil? And can I use grass clippings as mulch?
Yeah, I use grass clippings as mulch all the time. Yeah, anything you can put back in. I'm not clear. Is it a raised system? They said they get mulched. Is it in the ground?
It sounds like it's in the ground. It's a lot.
Okay, it's in the ground. I would say honestly, even just like what I was doing with my little garden where I had fruit trees and then I had some bokashi buckets in the ground. You know, even just putting some of those in maybe in the four corners or something and adding your bokashi food waste to that would start to feed that system. And those worms don't stop there. They'll start cruising everywhere. But you will probably start getting some fertility from that. Ron, what would you do with the grass clippings? Would you just apply it on top, or what would you do with it?
In a community garden where everybody has like a bed that's anywhere from like 50 to 100 square feet or more, I would probably do a cover crop, or not a cover crop, but plants that I can use throughout the year. And I would start a compost program on the community garden site, because you're producing all this green waste, as well as there should probably be some clippings of grass that dry that can be saved, and all of that can turn into a really nice compost pile. Because the hard thing about having a community garden is you're waiting each month to pull something out to put something back in, or every few months. So if you're trying to compost right there and throw a bunch of mulch in, it gets in the way. But all throughout the season, I would be chopping and dropping, so the leaves that I'm not going to harvest for eating, or the plants that could kind of lay down around the drip lines of the plants that are in the box, those would make good just mulch while you're waiting for the compost to come.
Now, Ron, would you say that, you know, if there's an option to opt out of it getting tilled, would that be a bonus? You know, not stop the tilling process and, you know, maintain a specific plot if you could, and just keep building fertility in that soil without tilling into it.
Yeah, for sure. Tilling in is probably the worst thing you can do for a just a soil bed. Is you're basically killing all, or not killing, but you're changing the structure of the soil. Tilling kind of makes this false, it's tillage. And if your soil has good tilth, it's loose and it breaks up in your hand. And we create that manually with machines by tilling something in, or mixing up the soil. But what it really does is it turns into something like concrete. So you lose all your pore structure, you kill lots of beneficial bacteria, and then your fungal networks are also disturbed, which those guys are probably the most important factor in having a long-term garden space, is your fungal networks, because they bring in the nutrition. And if you cut them up every few months or once a year, you have to restart the process.
All right, Ed, this next one is for you because we've already talked about this. Ron's already laughing. This is from one of the viewers, not my question unusually, but do you use or have you experimented with pee cycling, saving aging urine to use as a nitrogen source?
Now, I prefer to use my urine right away. I haven't practiced the aging process, but I definitely pee in my garden as much as I can. Right now, I'm kind of relegated to peeing in my backyard, where bananas like a lot of nutrients, and that's kind of my pee spot. But my ultimate dream is to be as wild as Ron's yard, where I can step out and pee in my yard and not worry about anyone complaining. But Ron, there was you gave us some statistics the other day about the value of urine as a fertilizer. I can't remember what it was, but it was kind of amazing. Can you share?
I was saying that one person, their urine that they produce in a year could fertilize all the plants that they eat for that year. So you think about how much fertility we're flushing down the toilet with nice fresh water that could be going into your yard. And if your soil microbes are in good balance, like you don't have any of the problems. So a lot of people are like, well, my dogs pee on my lawn and it destroys the lawn. But in a good garden, you go pee in the mulch, and basically you're cycling nutrient. You're providing nitrogen into the system that could fertilize your yard for a couple weeks.
Yeah,
Ron, you were telling me about the dog poop and Bocashi. Can you explain a little bit of that?
So one of the things that when I started producing Bocashi for sale, is there was a company that was producing a Bocashi kit that specifically was for recycling and composting of dog waste. I say stick to dogs because cats have some things that you don't want to deal with, but dog waste, they had this Bocashi kit that basically had the bucket and it didn't have a drain, and you added the bran. And so I only had small dogs, so it really wasn't a issue for me. I like I told you, Troy, I threw their dog waste under my orange tree and it thrived. But yeah, I have a friend who would buy Bocashi from me just to process his dog waste. They didn't have a lot of food waste. They ate out a lot. And they bought Bocashi just to process their dog waste. And they said their trees in their small backyard loved it. You would not want to do this in a garden space where you're going to be eating of that food, or if you're close to the water table or anything. But under the right circumstances, dog waste is just as fertile as any other manure, probably more so.
So we've talked about rotten food, urine, and dog waste. I got a question from a viewer asking, does Bocashi smell?
Ed, do you want to start with that?
Yeah. Depends. Actually, you know what? It depends. Now it's kind of funny. I am so used to it. It smells a little bit like kind of ferment, maybe sauerkrauty.
Like pickles to me.
Pickles, yeah. I mean, it just depends on if you put enough in, it doesn't have an unpleasant smell. It smells sort of like I don't know, sort of something pickling.
Yeah.
Now I use it as an aftershave. Well, I actually don't shave, so I just put a little. I put a little there, and it drives Karen crazy when after I process my Bocashi.
Bocashi does have a smell, and if it's off-putting, closing the container it's one of the main things. But adding what you add to the Bocashi bucket is going to kind of dictate that. Like I just ate pineapple, and I love putting like sweet material from fruits into my bin because that fermentation process loves the sugar, and then the smells you get are a lot better than, say, if you just put a bunch of rotten meat or fish or something in your bucket.
Now, we're going a bit over time here, but we still got a lot and a lot of questions. Here's from Don D. What are your thoughts on the negative or positive benefits of the invasive earthworms that stay in the upper layer of the soil? You want me to read that again?
Yeah, read that one more time.
What are your thoughts on the negative or positive benefits of the invasive earthworms that stay in the upper layer of the soil?
Invasive. So invasive is interesting. Like I read a really good article or a book on bringing earthworms in general, and there's many kinds of worms, and most of the worms that are in the upper surface are composting worms, usually red worms, and they recycle nutrient, but they can offset the balance of that nutrient in the upper layers of soil, which could change the environment. And so bringing in worms is not always a good thing, especially if you're bringing in worms to a place that doesn't have them. Here in California, it's not an issue. Most parts of the world already have a worm population that is going to recycle nutrients in the soil, whether they're regular earthworms that come up to the surface and then dive down a couple feet and bring air and nutrition down, or red worms that just process like leaf mold and stuff at the top of the surface. But yeah, you definitely want to think about what you're doing and if you're being regenerative when you're doing certain things. And I would do a little bit of research before I brought worms in, but feeding what's already there is not an issue, in my opinion. If I'm just composting on the surface of my soil, I'm basically doing what nature naturally does. But coming in and bringing 1,000 pounds of worms and throwing them in my soil, that might offset some things.
Okay, Ed, I'm going to toss this one to you. My entire property was recently burnt by a wildfire, complete loss. We're rebuilding and starting over completely in the yard space. Do you have any suggestions on where to start at square one? I live in Utah, high elevation, and sandy, and the soil has been recently scorched.
Okay, so I'm a big fan of, if you have that, I look at that as an opportunity. You know, you can shape this however you want. So what I'd be doing is I would be doing earthwork where I would be setting up and looking at where I could focus water in specific zones that I wanted things to thrive. So I'd be looking at, if I was building a new house, you know, if my whole house, everything was gone, I'd be designing, if you're allowed, a gray water system. I'd be figuring out where my runoff from my roof is going to be, where I could officially capture that. And then not only, you can only put so much in a tank, but really, how do I store that in the ground? And so I would be looking at the ground first and start to look at how can water come off of my house and flow into an indention that would capture water, and then how can that water overflow into the next indention and capture water, and try to do that as much as I can around the entire property so that I'm really setting water into my soil, because that's, if you don't get a lot of rain or whatever, that's an issue. Then I would be passing it to Ron, who's going to be more of your soil expert. But my first thing is I'd be considering what biomatter I was bringing in. So Ron, why don't you cover that part of it?
Yeah. So when you have an area that, like they said, it's a complete loss. It's not actually a complete loss. It's a restart of everything above the soil. And there's probably a seed bank that's already there that once the rains hit will start to regrow some vegetation. What that vegetation is to be determined, but it gives you the opportunity to, if you know that there's a lot of weeds and stuff, to maybe get some cover crop seeds from Peaceful Valley or something that are specifically geared for the zone in which you're growing these plants, or that you're going to be growing these plants, and bringing in those seeds. And a lot of times those seeds have wheat and oats and vetch or beans, field peas. And field peas and beans, they basically are nitrogen fixers. So they have the ability to come in and, without much nutrient from the soil, or having to add a lot of nutrient, they're able to take nitrogen from the air and fix that into their root system, and that starts to rebuild the soil quickly. So you really don't have to go out and buy a bunch of stuff. If there's bean trees or beans that you automatically grow or you want to grow, they're a great start because they don't need any extra fertilizer. A lot of people will grow beans and cut them off at the roots, or till them in, or just push them over and then grow into that biomass. So that's where I would start. But like Ed said, figuring out where the water is going to go, so you can have a lot more resiliency to these fire events that are obviously going to become more of the norm as we get drier and drier. You want to hold water in the soil.
So you guys have talked about microbes and biomass, and Becky Mendoza would like to know, what about biochar?
Ron, you're the master on that one.
So biochar, we talked about carbon. So most life is carbon based, and it's funny that when you have an event where you have a wildfire that comes through, it chars everything, and all that carbon goes back into the system. Some of it, of course, burns off into the atmosphere, but there's a lot of char that's there. And what people have determined is, down in South America and some other places, where they would take their material and burn it, and all that carbon kind of got into the soil and it became much more stable. And instead of flowing off into the atmosphere by CO2 or carbon monoxide, that carbon is stable, and it allows plants to grow a little bit better. There's a lot of research where they don't know how much better, but carbon in the soil is always a good thing. And taking some waste material and burning it through what's called pyrolysis, which means burning without air, you burn off a lot of the non-carbon materials and leave the carbon, and it forms these pockets of air and space where, once that's in the ground, nutrient and water can pool into those little spaces and then make themselves available as needed.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time here, but I'm going to throw up one more question. I guess we'll send this one to Ed. This is Jared is asking, in a more urban environment, do you have concerns about lead or other toxins in the native soil? Same goes for toxins in rainwater off of pavement.
Yeah, there's toxins in everything. Even, there's always talk even about mulch and persistent herbicides and the herbicides in general. I really used to kind of worry about that. And then when I met Ron, we started talking about mycelium, and one of its roles is to lock up toxins. Ron can talk more about that, but basically it's the process of sort of binding up these molecules so that they're benign. And so out at the farm, it's really tough for us to get mulch, and because there's so much demand for it out on these ranches. But we can get a lot of horse bedding, and so they'll literally cover a ranch 8 feet deep of horse bedding, which is basically wood chips and horse manure, if you let them. And so we get that, and the question is always, okay, well, we don't know what they fed these horses, and so it could be dewormers and all these other things. And so every time I've brought that up, Ron is a big believer in nature. And really the answer that he sort of told me was compost it for as long as you can. And the more mycelium that's in the ground, the more opportunity it has to lock these things up. And on top of that, if you just moved into an old gas station lot, and it's like, that the whole place is, don't be growing potatoes. Don't be eating the potatoes out of there. Like, there's certain, if that there's just something so toxic, then, maybe Ron can recommend some things that you absolutely don't want to eat. But I know things, root vegetables, carrots, potatoes, things that our root systems will actually soak that stuff up. Ron, what do you think about that?
Yeah, you have lots of interactions between the environment that's happening below the soil. And again, we're talking regenerative systems. So if you look at the natural systems that are regenerative, they have what's called a wetland, and they have plants that do uptake those toxins before, and they basically filter them out. So designing your landscape to mitigate anything that's coming on, or kind of clean itself and make that water clean before it goes into your fruiting and harvesting area, is a good thing. So I use a plant called vetiver, and it has these really deep roots that can go 10 or more feet down into the soil, and their tensile strength is really strong, like as strong as steel, I believe. And that vetiver grass grows in this clump, and I can put it in a certain area, and as water is filtering past it, it's going down through those roots, and they're uptaking the nutrient that would otherwise, or could otherwise, be bad. It can be toxins, or it can just be extra fertilizer. If you're in an area like Ed out in Valley Center, where there's a lot of orchards that are putting fertilizer into their ground. So having a plant that can act as a little wetland will mitigate some of those things. So I have my water that comes onto my property, a lot of it is off my street, right off the asphalt. And I have friends that were concerned or are concerned. I don't have that much concern because it goes through a whole little system of plants before it gets into my trees, where I would otherwise be eating the fruit that comes from that water, but it's kind of filtered.
Guys, unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but Ron, do you have a contact that people could reach out to you on your Instagram, possibly?
Yeah, feed the soil is probably the best way on Instagram or Facebook. I'm working on some bigger projects that might open some doors to websites, and maybe they can ask Patagonia to bring in some more of these talks. So yeah, but for right now, feed the soil through Instagram or feed the soil on Facebook is the best way to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Thanks, Ron. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.
And Ed, how can they get a hold of you?
They can either, direct message me on Instagram, either at the Enjoy Ham Plains account or Enjoy, I think it's _the_farm is another one they can hit me up at. And yeah, we'd be happy to answer questions. So this has been fun. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Troy.
Thank you. All right, guys, that concludes our show. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for all the questions. And we look forward to doing this again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.